The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. A quick note that food will be served at the end of today's event. Today's forum is presented as part of the University of Utah Societal Impact Seminar Series. We want to thank the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute for their leadership on this event. Now we're excited to introduce our first Societal Impact Scholar, Dr. Michael R. Strain. Dr. Strain is a Director of Economic Policy Studies and Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a Bloomberg opinion columnist. His research and writing span a wide range of areas, including labor markets, public finance, social policy, and macroeconomics. He has published several dozen articles in leading academic and policy journals. We are in for an interesting and informative discussion on pressing economic issues facing our country today. As we are nearly 1 week away from the 2024 election, today's discussion will not focus on the current political landscape. Instead, it will focus on broad and consequential economic themes, irrespective of a presidential election year. Dr. Strain will be joined in conversation by Natalie Gochner, Director of the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute and Associate Dean at the David Eccles School of Business. I will turn it over to her to get us started, but first please join me in welcoming Dr. Strain to our campus.
Thank you so much for the introduction of Michael. I'm so excited to share Michael with you today. Again, I'm Natalie Gochner, and I lead the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute. I'm an alum of the University of Utah and a former Hinckley intern, so I always feel comfortable when I'm up here. We want to engage in a dialogue here for the first 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. And I'm just going to ask Michael some questions about the US economy, about macroeconomics, about some of the concepts and issues that are important to our world today, and do it in a respectful way that recognizes that we're about a week away from an election, and we want to be really mindful to set a real high bar of sort of dignity and respect of differing opinions and the like. How does that sound, everybody? Sound good? Okay, very nice. Okay, I brought my most recent edition of The Economist magazine. If you see this here today, economics is my background. You'll see how it says, the envy of the world, America's economy. And this isn't the popular press, Michael. Everybody's talking about economic stress and confusion about what's happening, and yet the premier English-speaking magazine on the economy is talking about the U.S. economy as the envy of the world. Mm-hmm. What's the truth?
Well, the U.S. economy is the envy of the world. I think that is true when you compare how the U.S. is doing to other countries. But the U.S. has some problems. How many of you all are a little nervous about maybe one day being able to buy a house? How many of y'all are a little nervous about maybe one day paying off any student debt you have? How many of you all are a little irritated that your lunch or your dinner is 20 or 30% more expensive today than it was 5 or 6 years ago? So we have some challenges. It is normal to have challenges. As you advance through your careers and your lives, the challenges will change. But what will remain constant is that the U.S. economy will have some issues to deal with, and policymakers will have some issues to deal with. We're dealing with the ones that we have. We've done an okay job with it. But it's important not to, I think, confuse the existence of challenges or the specific challenges with the broader picture. And the broader picture is that the U.S. is doing quite well, and all of you at such a great university, all of you who are interested enough in public affairs to carve an hour out of your life to come to this session, should have confidence that if you work hard and study hard and make good choices, that you're all going to be fine.
Michael, tell us, you and I have spent the day together, and we've been thinking about some of the really seminal economic events of the past 10, 15 years. Mm-hmm. We had the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, the pandemic, pandemic recession, and now we've had all these years, we can say, of high inflationary environment. Mm-hmm. What is it about inflation that makes it so difficult for both families, individuals, but also for our feelings about life and about our economy.
Yeah. So, a few things. I mean, we talk a lot about, how, what's your wage. I suppose what you have jobs, and those of you who have jobs think about your hourly wage, and people who have salaries, think about their annual salary. What's my salary? What am I making? But what really matters to your consumption is purchasing power. And so your wage matters. It also matters how expensive stuff is. Your salary matters. It also matters how expensive stuff is. And when prices are rising, which is what we mean when we say inflation, when prices are going up at an unusually fast pace, stuff's more expensive, and you can buy less stuff with your wages and with your incomes. And quite naturally, people don't like that. Another thing that happens when we have high inflation is that in order to get inflation back down, policymakers raise interest rates. And the point of raising interest rates is to make it a little more expensive to spend money on your credit card, make it a little harder to buy a car, make it a little harder to buy a house. But, people like buying cars, people like buying houses, people like spending money on their credit cards. And so those interest rates become a problem as well. And then finally, when we get inflation under control, the rate at which prices are going up has slowed, but prices are still high. When I was your age, I used to be able to buy a can of soda for a quarter. And I remember when that quarter got raised to 35 cents. And that was annoying. That people didn't use credit cards back then, so this was annoying because that meant I had to have a quarter and a dime to buy a soda from the vending machine. Well, now it's like $3, and inflation has been pretty low for the period of time from when I was an undergraduate student to today. But the price of that soda hasn't gone down. And that's true for prices generally throughout the economy. And it takes a little while to get used to higher prices.
So we are here in 2024, and we have a variety of incoming economic issues that are affecting us. Some of them have been going on for a while. Many of them will continue for a while. Let's just tick off a couple of those. The national debt. Wow.
High.
There seems to be an endless appetite to spend and an endless appetite to cut taxes. And you have a wonderful metaphor for how you talk about this. I wonder if you'd share this metaphor of how we think about debt as in termites and bears.
Yes. So
Remind them what the metaphor is.
You can think about there being kind of two kinds of economic problems. So, imagine you're in your house and everything is going fine, and it's maybe a Sunday and you're watching football or whatever, and your life is good, and then all of a sudden a bear shows up at your front door and tries to break into your house and cause a whole bunch of problems. Call that the bear at the door problem. And then imagine that you've got a house, you're in your house, and there are a whole bunch of termites in your house, and they're eating all the wood in the foundation of your house. And, that's not a big deal that day. Your house today is pretty similar to how it was last week. But over time, those termites can rot out your house and make your house unsafe to live in. We talk about the national debt as a kind of bear at the door problem, right? Like one day something bad will happen, and there'll be some sort of crisis in financial markets, and that could happen, and that's something to worry about. But the national debt has been hurting economic outcomes for decades in a termites in the woodwork sense, by making it a little more expensive for businesses to buy equipment and to invest in software and to invest in other things, which makes workers a little bit less productive each year, which lowers their wages a little bit each year, which lowers their household incomes. And so compared to this year, compared to last year, the national debt hasn't caused that many problems for the United States this year relative to last year. But this has been a problem for like 30 years, and every year, if things are a little bit worse than they were the year before, add that up over a few decades, and you've got people who are earning a lot less money than they could, and who are less prosperous than they otherwise could.
Michael, put a few numbers to it. So what has the debt to GDP ratio been in the past? What is it today? Where's it headed?
So, over the last half century, the amount of debt that the U.S. holds has been about half the size of the amount of output the U.S. economy produces every year.
So 50% debt to GDP ratio, roughly speaking.
In the military buildup during World War II, that rose to about 100%. So the amount of money the U.S. owed bondholders equaled the size of the economy as a whole, kind of the amount of goods and services the U.S. economy makes every year. This makes sense. In a war, you've got to borrow money to build tanks and bombs and planes, and you got to borrow money to pay soldiers, and you need to do what you need to do to win the war. And that was the high watermark for U.S. debt for decades and decades. Pretty soon next year, we're going to tie that record. So the U.S. will have a 100% debt to GDP ratio for the first time since the World War II military buildup. And that's going to continue to grow over the next 10, 20, or 30 years unless Congress and the president do something about it.
Fair enough. Okay. Let's do this one now. I mentioned a variety of economic issues that we're thinking about. We've covered debt. Talk to us about tariffs. Help a broad audience with differing backgrounds understand the ABCs of tariffs.
So tariffs are taxes on imported goods. Those taxes are levied kind of on the importer, right? But the people who ultimately pay the tax in an economic sense are you all. And so, imagine that we're talking about cigarette taxes, and the government says, okay, we don't want people to smoke cigarettes. We're going to, put a big tax on cigarettes. If you're, selling cigarettes, then you've got a choice to make. Are you gonna raise the price of the cigarettes you're selling so that the person buying the cigarettes actually pays the taxes? Or are you gonna let your profit margin fall because you have to pay the government a big chunk of your revenue to satisfy that tariff obligation? Depending on the good that's being tariffed, depending on the tax, sometimes people pay that tax, sometimes businesses pay that tax. And so ultimately it's kind of an empirical question about who's paying the tax. But what we've discovered is that, if the government says, okay, if you're a company and you import a bunch of T-shirts that are made in China, then you have to pay a 10% tariff on the value of those T-shirt imports. So now you buy all these T-shirts, you write the government a check for 10% of the value. It turns out that what's been happening over the last few years is that the company selling the T-shirt to Americans just raises the price by about 10%. And so it's making stuff more expensive for consumers.
I'm going to do one more and then we'll open up for questions. It's hard to think of talking about tax policy in a few minutes. But when I first met you, Michael, it was about the earned income tax credit. Mm-hmm. We also have child tax credits that are expanding, and both of them are sort of designed to address, poverty and help with families and whatnot. Mm-hmm. How about the ABCs, if everyone's interested in this, of just trying to understand what's going on with the child tax credit? This is something that both candidates currently are talking about. Mm-hmm. The CTC, as they say, the child tax credit, is on the move. Give us what's going on with the child tax credit.
So the U.S. tax code has a bunch of tax credits. This is a term in tax policy, and the basic idea is that you earn a bunch of money, and you have to figure out how much taxes you owe. And so let's say you earn $100, and you figure out your tax rate. And let's say your tax rate is 15%. Well, now you have to write a $15 check to the government, and this happens every year at tax time. What a tax credit does is say, whoa, well, wait a minute, if you qualify, you can reduce that 15 bucks. And so what the child tax credit says is that if you have a child, then instead of owing $15, you owe $12. And this has been a bipartisan policy. This was part of you all know Newt Gingrich, if I say that name. This was part of Newt Gingrich's Contract for America back in the 1990s. And the child tax credit was expanded by presidents and Congresses of both parties since then. The most recent time it was expanded was during the American Rescue Plan under President Biden. The time before that, it was expanded by President Trump in 2017 as part
on the
of
move.
It's on the
Yeah,
move.
yeah.
People like it, and the point was to offer tax relief for parents of kids. It's expensive to raise kids, and Congress says, well, let's try and help parents out and make it a little less expensive by giving them this tax credit. And these are expensive. There's some concern that if you make make child tax credits too big, you're going to reduce the number of parents who have jobs, who work. They cost the taxpayers a lot of money because a lot of people have kids, so a lot of people qualify for the credit. It may be something that's interesting is that it may be a point of bipartisan consensus. Vice President Harris really wants to expand the generosity of the child tax credit. J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side, has said that he wants to do the same thing too. President Trump hadn't really bought into that, at least publicly. And so there's a little bit of ambiguity about whether or not a second Trump administration would want to expand it. But it was expanded because of pressure from Senator Lee here in Utah and Senator Rubio of Florida. It was expanded in 2017 during the last tax reform, and so maybe it would be again if President Trump wins as well.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Looks like we've got mics. So let's go into some questions for Michael and see where that takes us. And if there's others, I can weigh in as well.
Yeah,
I'll let you pick who you go
so please
to.
just wait until you have a microphone handed to you, and then we'll prioritize student questions. So thank you. Go over here first.
I wanted to go back to talking about the national debt. You mentioned that next year is when we're going to be tying our record for that. Are you saying that because of what the economics are looking like up into that, or are you taking into account the Tax Cut and Job Acts and that expiring and stuff? And if not, how is that going to play into our national debt?
Yes. So the tax cuts reduce the 2017 tax cuts, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, reduce the amount of revenue that comes into the U.S. government. That increases the size of the budget deficit. And then
And these were passed in 2017.
In 2017.
Commonly referred to as the JCTA.
And all the debt is just the kind of accumulation of those annual deficits. And so if Congress and the president, in a bunch of the tax cuts that were passed in 2017 expire next year. And so if Congress and the president say, okay, well, we'll let those expire, then tax revenue will go up, the deficit will shrink, and the rate at which we accumulate debt will go down. If you look at the kind of dynamics of what's happening over the next 10 years, what you see is that tax revenue is kind of expected to be pretty flat. Spending is expected to go up. If we let all those tax cuts expire, then each year the gap between revenue and spending would be lower. But the problem that the U.S. faces is that spending is not the level, but the trend, right? So spending would still be on an upward trend, even if the level of revenue were to increase. So allowing those tax cuts to expire would lower the deficit, and it would slow the pace at which this problem grows, but the problem would still be growing.
One up front right here.
Awesome. So how much of the U.S.'s recent economic strength do you think can be attributed to organic growth versus the U.S. running historically high, like, peacetime deficits?
That's an excellent question. I think both. So the United States has run a very expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, at least in 2020, 2021, 2022. Then kind of the Fed and Congress started fighting each other, right? So the Fed started raising interest rates, trying to cool the economy, but Congress and the president still wanted to kind of juice the economy by running large deficits. And there's no question but that, well, I shouldn't say that. In my view, the economy reacts to fiscal and monetary policy. And so when the government is running deficits, that increases the demand for goods and services on the part of businesses and households, and that leads to demand side strength. And so in that sense, economic policy has played a major role. But I also think that it's important to emphasize that a whole lot of this is organic. One of the most amazing.
Organic in this sense kind of mean like our fundamentals are good?
Yeah, a lot of it is
Trying
not
to
driven by.
put words to that.
A lot of it's not driven by things that the Federal Reserve or Congress are doing, and a lot of it is driven by American workers and American businesses. One of the most remarkable things of the last 4 years to me is the fact that during the pandemic, the rate at which Americans start businesses shot way up. And enough time has passed now that that's not I think we can say that's not a temporary thing. These are businesses that people want to last. And so, why is the US doing comparatively better? You didn't see anything like that happen in Europe, and you didn't see anything like that happen in Japan. The American people experienced this pandemic, and part of their response was, I'm going to start a business. I'm going to try to figure out how I can provide a service or how I can produce a product that people need. And that's a remarkable response. I think it really speaks extremely well about the creativity and ambition and risk tolerance of the American people, the resilience of the American people in the face of such a horrible and devastating event. That's not confined to the pandemic. America has a wonderful economy because American workers and American businesses are amazing in so many ways, both relative to the rest of the world, I think, but also just in an absolute sense. And I think a lot of times in policy discussions, we give too much credit or blame to policy. And a whole lot of, most of the reason why America is such a great place to work and such a great place to be in business is because of Americans, not because of government.
Up right front right here.
You were talking about tariffs earlier. How realistic would it be that, one of the goals of tariffs is that to bring manufacturing more back to the United States because it's obviously gone more overseas to other countries. How realistic with some of these with the talk on tariffs, how realistic would it be to bring that manufacturing back to the United States within 5 to 10 years? And would it be more of a niche focus? Would it be more on, especially with the passing of the CHIPS Act, like would it be more like critical technology and like automaking, for example, or would it be just not as feasible considering they may just go to other countries like Vietnam or India or wherever?
So I think that's a great question, and I think it kind of depends on what you mean by feasible. So we have these two laws that are in part designed to increase manufacturing sector employment, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. Combined, those two laws are probably going to cost around $1.1 trillion. And it would be surprising to me if we spent $1.1 trillion subsidizing the manufacturing sector and we did not see some service sector workers move into the manufacturing sector. But manufacturing employment has been declining for 70 years. The reason it's been declining is because of technological advances that allow factories to produce more stuff. We're producing more stuff than ever. Manufacturing output is near an all-time high. So we're able, because of technology, to produce more stuff with fewer workers. That's the fundamental economic reality of what's happening in the manufacturing sector. The same thing happened in the agriculture sector. It used to be that most American workers worked in agriculture, and then technology on farms became better and better and better. Now less than 1% of Americans work in agriculture. A similar thing is happening with manufacturing. I think we're down to about 8% of the workforce right now working in manufacturing. And so, will the rate at which manufacturing employment declines slow? It's possible. Will we see a bit of an uptick? I think that's possible too. But the way that politicians talk about this is, kind of a return to some sort of a heyday, right? Like a return to the 1970s, a return to the 1950s. And that, I think, is basically impossible.
Is there a national security argument for the chip investments that this country's making?
There could be. I think that so, there are these computer chips, right? Semiconductors, and these are very important. These are chips that power missiles. These are chips that power defense systems. These are chips that are used in fighter jets. These are chips that are used in satellites and surveillance systems. So these are important. And a whole lot of them are manufactured in Taiwan. And Taiwan is heavily exposed to Chinese geopolitical aggression. And so it is conceivable that as part of China's broader strategic ambitions, it's possible that as part of China's increasingly adversarial relationship with the U.S., that they might, surround Taiwan with a whole bunch of Chinese military naval vessels and say, no more chips. And that would be a real problem for the United States. It would be a problem for our national security. It would be a problem if you want to buy a car. It would be a problem if you want to buy a computer. It would be a big problem. And that I think is pretty compelling argument.
It's interesting that the national defense might be the more compelling of the two arguments.
Sure. Yeah.
Rather than an economic. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah. I think it is a very, very large leap from that analysis. Maybe we don't want this incredibly important product so exposed to Chinese strategic competition and geopolitical instability. Big leap from that observation to the observation that therefore that activity should be located in swing states in the U.S. presidential election. And, we are conflating these things. And so, why not have more of it located in Japan? Why not have more of it located in Holland? Why not have more of it located in South Korea? Why not have some of it located in Mexico? Those are important questions that are not often asked. A second question that's not often asked is, even if the U.S. gives $9 billion of taxpayer money to Intel, which is what we did, can Intel actually take that money and build a chip factory that's able to produce the chips that we're so worried about? That's not obvious. If I had to bet, I would bet against Intel being able to do that. And so,
Because of workforce constraints mostly, or?
workforce constraints, technological constraints. Intel is an extremely troubled company. Right after Intel received that gift of $9 billion of other people's money, they laid off 10% of their workforce. Their share price plummeted, and there's lots of talk in Washington about a bailout for Intel. And so, these are issues. So we're conflating in the public debate a whole bunch of things, like legitimate concerns about China, legitimate concerns about chip production, the goal of revitalizing a U.S. manufacturing sector. Trying to do 10 things at once is often a way to get nothing done.
Okay, we have a quick question up front right here.
My question is about tariff. How do the tariff affect individual sectors?
Well, it depends on the sectors in which the tariffs are levied. And so, the United States put a bunch of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. That made it, more expensive to build things that use steel and aluminum. If you're a manufacturing company in the United States and you make tin cans or you make, air conditioning ducts, all of a sudden it became more expensive for you to do that because of those tariffs. We put tariffs on a wide swath of imports from China. So if you go to Walmart and you want to buy some T-shirts and those T-shirts were made in China, those T-shirts are now more expensive because of the tariffs in China. China retaliated primarily against the U.S. agriculture sector, and that really made life hard for a lot of farmers. And so the Trump administration enacted a bunch of subsidies to U.S. agriculture in order to counteract the effect of those tariffs. And so, different sectors kind of get hit by tariffs in different ways. But I have yet to see any evidence that any sector, came out ahead as a consequence of these policies.
And then one back here.
I was wondering about something you said at the beginning. You said the United States is the economic envy of the world. And I'm just wondering if we could drill down on that definition a little bit, because I think it depends on how we're defining economic success. Well, the United States does very well in places like GDP, has some of the lowest inflation in the world post-pandemic. We rate 32nd out of 37 of OECD nations in terms of economic equality. We rate 100 out of 194 United Nations regions in terms of economic equality. So what would you say to somebody who might question the way that we're defining economic success and what it means for everyday Americans? Because as somebody who struggles to pay rent and for food every month, I don't really feel like we're the economic envy of the world in regions that matter to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think that there are, kind of big aggregate indicators that, there's pretty widespread agreement that we should care about. The unemployment rate measures how hard it is for a worker to get a job. The U.S. has quite low unemployment. GDP measures how much stuff the U.S. produces every year. This is a reasonable measure to use. Income per capita kind of tells you, how much income there is in the economy per person. that's a very important measure to use as well. And I think by these conventional, widely accepted metrics, and others, the U.S. is outperforming other countries, and that was also true, I think, before the pandemic. It's a little hard to talk about emerging economies and developing economies. Sometimes they have like really rapid GDP growth, but they're starting from a very low base. So even given these widely agreed upon measures, it can be difficult. It can be difficult to make these judgments. So ultimately, it's a judgment, right? I mean, there's no rule about how to make these assessments. It's a judgment. I think it's quite reasonable to be concerned about inequality. I think comparisons between the United States and European nations about inequality can be hard to make for a few reasons. America is a huge, diverse country. We are a continental nation. 330 million people or thereabouts live here. Europe, we're a very diverse nation, diverse racially, ethnically, in terms of religious background, in terms of political opinion.
Economically? Fair enough.
We're very diverse economically as well. A lot of European countries are much smaller, much more homogenous across a range of issues. And so, when I think about comparing relative outcomes like inequality between the U.S. and Europe, I think it's more instructive to treat each U.S. state as its own nation, and kind of make that comparison that way. It's also the case that America is much, if you think about inequality as kind of like the rungs on a ladder, right? So income is the height of the ladder, and inequality is like how tall is that ladder, right? What's the size of the gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom? In Europe, where countries are less wealthy, they have less income, then the ladder is shorter, and almost kind of by definition, right, the gaps between the rungs of the ladder are smaller. In America, where we have way more income, the ladder is taller, and so kind of because it's taller, like the gap between the top and the bottom is bigger. And so, it's a little bit hard, I think, to think about in a rigorous way. What do we mean when we say that Denmark has less inequality than America? There are some issues in the United States where I think Europe's doing better than we are, and one of those, for example, is life expectancy. The U.S. has higher life expectancy than Europe, but there are many nations in Europe that have higher life expectancy than the United States. Again, like, does it make sense to compare the United States to Norway? I don't know, maybe. But the U.S. Has a lot of unsafe driving. The U.S. has a lot of guns, and those guns result in deaths. The U.S. has a lot of drug addiction, and so I think I'm comfortable saying the U.S. is lagging behind Europe on those sorts of issues, and we could do better there. So it's a complicated comparison, and it's ultimately a subjective judgment. But I feel pretty comfortable in saying that the United States is doing better than Europe in an economic sense.
And if I'm correct, we're done at 12:45, so we'll have time for about one or two more questions. We'll take one from this side of the room over here.
I don't know if you can hear me. Okay. Thank you for coming today. You talked about the deficit in terms of spending and tax revenue. Something that I don't hear people talk a lot about is deregulation, in terms of you should have a regulatory environment where certain things are allowed, certain things are not. but a lot of the legislation that is passed, there's not sunset clauses put on these, and so they stay on the books for years, and they kneecap businesses and what they're capable of doing. And so really the two ways to get out of this deficit crisis that we have is either inflation or growth. And so what factor do you see deregulation having in reaching that growth that can help us over decades overcoming our deficit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, how do you maybe take one step back? How do you deal with the debt? One way is by reducing the deficit, the rate at which we accumulate debt. Another way is through inflation, right? Because debt is nominal. Like you owe $100, and so if $100 becomes worth less because of inflation, and then a way that should receive much more attention than it does, because we think of the debt in relation to the amount of output the economy produces, you could increase the amount of output the economy produces. Economic growth is a way out of the debt problem, and that's what we did following World War II. That's how we got out of our World War II debt problem, was by growing. And I think we should have much more focus on how economic growth can contribute here. There are two ways to grow your economy. You could either increase the rate at which your workforce grows, or you can make your workers more productive. It's extremely difficult to, craft policies to increase productivity growth. We don't really know how to do that. And to increase workforce growth, people either need to have more kids than they're having, or we need to have higher levels of immigration. And both of those seem pretty tough to achieve, at least over the near term. And so that's why I think a lot of the focus is on deficit reduction. But you're exactly right that economic growth should be a big part of the solution, and deregulation is an important way to get that growth.
But just to follow up, in terms of how much would that help in terms of deregulating?
I think it depends on. I think it could be big, or it could be small. It could be counterproductive. We have some regulation that I think actually contributes to economic growth. The Clean Air Act, for example, I think made the economy stronger and allowed the economy to grow.
People healthier.
People healthier.
Yeah.
We have a lot of regulation that is clearly an obstacle to growth, like the fact that, if I want to become a cosmetologist, I need to spend hundreds of hours in training to get my license. And so I think there's good regulation, there's bad regulation, and then there's a whole bunch in between where it's kind of a value judgment, and thinking about it more specifically is the way to figure out what the growth effects would be.
All right. Unfortunately, that is our time. We are out of time. A few quick notes before we go.
Hey, Nick, can I
yes.
do one quick thing?
Absolutely.
I would love you, Michael, to give the economics students, the political science students, public policy students, and give us a piece of advice, just as we end.
Oh my gosh.
If you're a student in 2024 in this environment, what advice would you impart to our students? Thanks for letting me do that, Nick.
So, maybe I should preface my advice by saying that I think you're all terrific, and these have really been excellent questions. I talked to a lot of student groups, and your questions have really been excellent. And the fact that you are all interested enough in public affairs and public policy to spend an hour here, really indicates that you're on a good track. I would not have been in this room if I were a student in 2024, and so I'm just very impressed by how interested you all are in these issues. I can think of a couple three pieces of advice maybe. First, take classes that will help you to learn about these issues. You're at a wonderful world-class university where you have access to all these experts and on the faculty and learn from them. You will all, I promise, wake up 20 years from now and think, boy, I really wish I had studied harder and done more and that sort of stuff. And, which is not to say you're not doing that now, but you'll look back on college as this amazing period in your life where, the only thing you had to do was learn interesting stuff from fascinating people and really, get the most out of that. I would read a newspaper every day, a newspaper, not Twitter or TikTok or whatever. Like subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, subscribe to the New York Times, subscribe to the Financial Times, and you're not going to be able to make it through the whole paper every day, but look at the headlines every day, and try and understand what's happening in the world outside of your classes. And third, find people who you don't agree with and learn from them. Read articles and essays and columns by people who you don't agree with and learn from them. Find people in your community who you don't agree with and talk to them. And develop a habit of intellectual humility and a habit of civil, respectful dialogue with people who don't share your views. You will learn so much. Maybe your mind will be changed. Maybe your mind won't be changed, but you will have a stronger sense of why you believe what you believe. And you will be much, much better prepared to leave college and enter the workforce if you're able to develop the skill of viewpoint empathy, and if you're able to develop the skill of civil engagement and disagreement with people who don't see the world the way you do. The world is very complicated. I've changed my mind about very central issues. It's hard to know what's going on out there. It's hard to know what the right answer is. The questions we debate are really, really, really difficult. And practicing that skill of being open to the views of others is extremely important.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Strain, Natalie, for joining us today. Quick note to our students, we're going to let our guests get out. They're on to their next thing. So remain seated while we talk about the food situation. So thank you all for being here. Food, you're going to go out this door here in a moment. And we were thrilled with the turnout today. So you now have pizza and Cafe Rio. So please think of your fellow student behind you. Maybe get some of both. Because Cafe Rio might not spread to every single person. But there is pizza. Everybody's going to go away with food as well. So thank you for your understanding. Thank you for being here. And please, you may exit that way. If you don't need food, oh, okay. That door, I apologize. Okay.